Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'll get us kicked off. You're here in the session. We're so happy you're here to strengthen immunization as we move towards eradication. So just some thoughts before we kick off. Polio eradication, as I said this morning, we're at 11 cases today. Historic low. One of the most inspiring success stories of global public health, beyond smallpox. However, like every success, it comes with a price. And as we draw closer to eradication, our resources are going to decline. In many countries, delivery of immunization services has been heavily cross-subsidized by polio funding. So the ramp down of funding is a wake-up call to all of us, as we heard a lot this morning. It's a stark reminder of the risks that are at stake. But it's also an opportunity to shift the paradigm and for us to create a new vision of how we could do things differently. We all recognize the essential role that immunization services play in UHC. Immunization services is an indicator of whether other primary health services are actually reaching people. And it's one of the most impactful and cost-effective public health interventions. And it contributes to optimizing human capacity throughout the whole life course. So as we develop this post-2020 agenda, we have to think of how we can continually improve the quality and access to EPI while we may be working in a resource-scarce environment. The MDGs were primarily focused on public health, and in the era of SDGs, health is only one of those priorities. And as you saw in Helen's stark presentation this morning, we're working in an environment where there's many, many competing priorities. So how are we going to manage this strategic shift? I certainly don't have the answers. I'm sure our panel doesn't have the answers today, but I hope in this discussion as we engage, some things will come forth for us. But let me just put out some ideas to stimulate discussion. So how are we going to continue to push to improve and sustain immunization coverage achievements in the absence of polio campaigns? We have used polio campaigns for the past 30 years to keep population immunity high, to keep populations protected, and they've been a really integral part of that immunization delivery platform. We're going to shift away from that. We're not going to do that anymore, if you say. So routine delivery is going to be increasingly important to reinforce high vaccination coverage. We need a strategic shift in the surveillance paradigm. I spoke about that this morning during our 3-minute talk. It's well known that GPI has been funding our global VPD surveillance efforts, and the lab network, measles, yellow fever, JE are all on the backs of the polio funding. So how are we going to take a look at that once the polio funding decreases? And how do we use that as a chance to look at surveillance much more holistically? Third, how are we going to create better synergies? Again, this came up this morning, this idea about integration between immunization and other health initiatives. The polio program's been criticized for being too vertical, but I think we can't deny that it has had cross-cutting benefits. For many initiatives, particularly in immunization, we have polio-funded staff that conduct active case-based surveillance for polio and measles and other diseases. They are often our first-line surge staff to respond to an emergency or an outbreak, and they help us engage hard-to-reach communities. They help us mobilize demand, and they've provided the backbone of stronger health systems. So it's not realistic to assume that one single health program or initiative can absorb all those functions that have been supported by polio. So we're going to have to figure out how to leverage efficiencies in that new world. Lastly, we need to remind ourselves that strong immunization systems are the best insurance policy to keeping the polio world free. The world polio free, pardon me. So the circulating VDPV outbreaks in the African continent, in Nigeria, DRC, Somalia, PNG now, is a stark reminder of this. We cannot ensure the polio-free status of any region in the world unless we are investing in strong routine immunization delivery systems. And the weakest link will be the countries that have fragile health systems, which have depended on SIA approaches, for instance, to boost immunity. So we really have to work collectively to move forward and target how we stratify countries to manage this. So these are some of the thoughts, I think, that reinforce a lot of the discussion already we had this morning of how we're going to move forward, how we're going to meet the challenge of meeting UHC and the health-related SDGs. I think we actually don't have a choice. We're going to be ready. We have to be ready. We shall be ready to manage this. So thank you all for taking the time to come. We hope you engage and contribute and challenge the panel so that we can all think about the opportunities that we can create together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Diana. So this afternoon, I've got a very distinguished panel, as you can see. If I'm to read their, I've got like 6 pages of what these distinguished people have done. So you will pardon me. I will just, give a very abbreviated introduction. But to kick us off, we are going to have 3 people who are going to give us TED Talks. So the 3 people who are going to speak first have up to 6 minutes to introduce the subject. And to kick us off, we have Dr. Oteri, Joseph Oteri from the Ministry of Health, Nigeria. He is the chairman of the National Measles Technical Coordinating Committee. And he will tell us about how Nigeria has leveraged the Addis Declaration on Immunization to strengthen immunization in Africa. Dr. Oteri, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and I'm going to talk about the way Nigeria is leveraging on ADI to strengthen measure in Nigeria and Africa in general. Well, in the next 6 minutes, I will just give a little bit talk about that. And we've had a lot of declarations, because when this topic was brought, I brought it to my team in the agency, and one of them jokingly said, how many times are we going to have declaration? We've had declaration, and even the politicians are declaring. Then what came to mind is the Abuja Declaration of 2001, where countries were asked to earmark at least 15% of their budget to health. So the next question is that how many people really implemented that? I don't think most countries did that. So what are we doing about that? But when in 2016 the government of Africa came together and said, look, they want to have the Addis Declaration on Immunization, which is supposed to look at increasing and sustaining financial, political, and technical support to immunization. We said, yes, this is something that we need to do. And this is something Nigeria has actually said, yes, we will do this and do it well. So the country is actually committed to having this one done, and done well for the first time. And first of all, we have to accept that things are not going very well. So there was a mixed needs coverage survey of 2016 in the country, where we were told Nigeria had 33% coverage for Penta 3. And unlike in the past, we will contest. This time, we didn't contest it. We left it and said, yes, we accepted that, and let us see what we need to do. So in 2017, July specifically, a state of emergency was declared for routine immunization, another declaration again. And the executive director of NPSCDA, Dr. Feza, who most of you know, said there should be something done differently. So they created the National Emergency Routine Immunization Coordinating Center in Abuja. And what did they do? They sit down every day, look at what is happening in states in the country, and give them tasks and follow up with those tasks. They hold meeting from 8:30 every day, and it's on record that the chief executive, Dr. Feza, has attended virtually more than 90% of those meetings. And this is something to show that, look, yes, we need to get things done separately. Then 18 low-performing states were also prioritized, and they replicated NERIC in the form of SERIC, that is State Emergency Routine Management Coordinating Center. And what did they do? They also look at what's happening at the lower level in each state. So the NERIC is supporting the states, then the SERIC is looking at things happening in the state, making sure that they meet targets. Things that ought to be done are done. And we think with that one, a lot of improvement will come into that. Then what else did we do? We also adopted a 10-year strategic plan, But this time it's not only for immunization, it is for immunization and PSC strengthening. It's a big platform which Nigeria think, if implemented well, as it is being thought of now, we're going to get things done differently. It's a Gavi transition plan, and the country is committed to it. Over $2 billion is committed by the country to ensure that their vaccine needs for the next 10 years is handled. While Gavi is, I think, is supporting it with $1 billion, of which 760 goes for immunization vaccines, while 240 goes for PSC strengthening. So these are things they want to do to make sure that we live where we are. Then we also look at the investment in health. For the first time, the national budget was passed, and the National Assembly said, yes, they're going to add extra 1% to PSC. And this was matched with what they really talked, and this was done. The budget was just passed by the president, and this figure is already reflected in that budget. So we think with things like that there, I think things we do, we move better. Then the much talked about Health Act, which has been on for years in Nigeria, was passed by the president and assented to. So there's a guaranteed basic healthcare provision fund, which we think if it is there, we're going to have things differently in terms of routine immunization. Then we just concluded the measles campaign, and for the first time, the governors were committed. We took it to them. Now, look, this is something that it is not for WHO or UNICEF, it is for your children. So how much are you putting? And they brought a lot of money in the form of counterpart fund. Even those that were doubting changed their mind and did that. So the coverage for the campaign was quite okay, different from what we've been having. And most of the states that were not doing very well did well in that campaign. So these are some of the things. Then our president, since he came in, you know, the president of Nigeria doesn't do much of talking. He hardly talks. So when he comes out to talk on your behalf, that means he wants to do things. When he came in, he said, look, there's PSC needs to be revitalized. So he marked that, look, in this period, we should have at least one functional PSC in the world. And there are about 9,500 something wards in Nigeria. So 10,000 PSCs were marked to be made functional, out of which he flagged off one, and that has been the trend. Then what else did he also do? He also did a lot of things by ensuring that the Minister of Health and the Executive Director of MPSD stick to their timeline. The things that need to be done should be done. So he made sure the Minister and the Minister of Finance they speak to each other to ensure that things that are planned for healthcare are actually implemented. So those are positives that we think we're getting. Then in terms of approaches, innovations, we now have the optimized routine immunization, optimized integrated routine immunization sessions. This is a session which will help us to get immunization outside just immunization alone. Now it's an integrated format, so the health workers are more effective. They make sure that what needs to be done is done, and the children are given opportunity for wider intervention. So it's no longer just go to immunization, which is what they normally do. Because PSC, actually, if you take out immunization from PSC in Nigeria, that PSC center is gone. So that's something that has been done. Then the president also launched the CHIPS, Community Health Influencer Promoters Services, which is supposed to be a platform to create demand at the communities. So these are some of the interventions which the president has actually helped us to do as a country. Then we now use smartphones. Workers have been taught how to use smartphones to report their information directly to the national. So there's a server that receives that. So that is something that's been done to improve data quality. Then most of the states in the country are also adopted doing data quality self-assessment. So these are things that have been put together to make sure that the data is of good quality, and that is something very, very key. So when we look at what we've done in terms of polio, because we look at a lot of polio infrastructures which are now being replicated in other aspects. The measles campaign was done using polio infrastructure. We worked from the polio EOC. We use polio GIS maps. We use polio everything. So these are things that we're really putting to use. Then for others, vulnerable places, you have a lot of security challenges in the country. So for those places, they have planned for them. We'll have the reaching inaccessible communities, and we'll have the reaching every settlement, where the immunization workers go to the field with the aid of the military people. So if it is where the military cannot, if it is where the civilians cannot go, they go with the military people, they go with the vaccines and vaccinate. So that's some of the strategies that we think we are putting together. So in essence, political will, good financial backup, and most importantly, leadership and program coordination, proper leadership and program coordination are things that are actually driving us to where we are as a country. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oteri. Now we move to Southeast Asia. We are going to move to Dr. Pradeep Halder from the Ministry of Health, India. And you will be telling us how you have repurposed polio infrastructure to save the broader public health agenda. Over to you.
I thank the organizer for giving me the platform. When we look at the polio program in this country, we know that before the polio program was there in 1985, we were having almost 200,000 polio cases as estimated. We didn't have proper surveillance to know. When we started the pulse polio program in 1995, we had an estimated 50,000 odd polio cases, and that's where we started the pulse polio program. And we needed to also build a very good surveillance, and that's where we looked at 1997 when we looked at the WHO and created the National Polio Surveillance Unit. And that's the time when we started having the case-based surveillance. And right in the first year itself, after the part, we had almost 2,000 odd polio cases been line listed, and thereafter it's all on history that we continue to have those. But when we look at those histories, the last polio case was in January 2011. While we were using the NPSP structure for the polio surveillance, we also actually needed somebody to monitor the SIAs, see that the quality of the SIA happens, and that's where both the NPSP structures and all the partners who were there supporting us on the polio were also not only doing the surveillance but also pushing them into the SIAs and quality of SIAs. Once we have looked into this polio network, we also look beyond this polio network. When we look at the NPSP structure, we were looking at the BPD surveillance, we were looking at the measles rubella surveillance, which we started right in 2005, measles rubella surveillance. So it was almost been built upon the polio surveillance. And when we look at the polio surveillance, we had almost 40,000 units which was reporting across the country. And so we used up this 40,000 units for reporting the polio. We also looked at the RI strengthening through RI campaigns mode. We have used these polio structures also for the maternal and neonatal tetanus elimination validation processes. The areas of new vaccine introductions, because when we look at last 3-4 years, we had introduced a lot of new vaccines. Apart from the IPV, which was a part of the polio endgame strategy, we have introduced the hepatitis V, we had introduced the pentavalent vaccine, the rotavirus vaccines, the pneumococcal vaccine. So these were some of the new vaccines that we have gone into. While we were looking at the elimination component of the measles elimination and rubella and CRS control, that's where we had a massive target of almost 410 million children that we need to target. We have already covered 92 million, but it was not possible without having the support of the NPSPs and additional manpowers who were really looking into and moving into the field. Because when we look at the MR campaigns, we needed to have a coverage of more than 95%, and that's a big challenge. And so there was a lot of polio learnings and the polio areas that we were using up for this kind of a network to support us in this. Not only this area, but also I would say that we were looking at the other non-immunization activities like tuberculosis or Kala Azars. That's where we were looking at and support from these units. So when we look into these Government of India and specifically the Honorable Prime Minister has been giving thrust for improving the routine immunization coverage. And in fact, the target for routine immunization coverage for us, we look at a child receiving all vaccines within first year of life, what we usually call as full immunization. So that's the target that we were looking at. 90% of the children must receive full immunization within first year of life by 2020. But when the Prime Minister reviewed this program, and during the review he said, no, you need to prepone it and do it by December 2018. And looking at that part, we needed a lot of activities and what we call it Mission Indradhanush. So we started with the Mission Indradhanush right from 2015, and we had done through a different modes. Sometimes we've done through Gram Sabha Abhiyan, where we have focused the villages and tried to carry it out, or we have picked up some of the low-performing districts, what we call it aspirational districts. That's where we picked up and carried it out. And it's not possible without having used the NPSP structure. While we look at the NPSP structure for supporting us, Government of India, realizing the value that the NPSP structure had, also started looking at contributing to because there has been a resource gap. And Government of India decided that it will fund NPSP and see to it that this resource gap does not translate into a place where they will find it difficult to sustain. And Government of India has started funding NPSP and ensuring that the NPSP structures exist and the value addition to the program is there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Halder. Now we will move to Dr. Heather Scobie from CDC, who will give us some insights as to how we can think differently about surveillance. Over to you, Heather.
Great. So good afternoon. So currently for VPD surveillance, we have national case-based surveillance for polio, measles, and neonatal tetanus in most countries. And in some countries, we have sentinel case-based surveillance for one or more of a variety of diseases. And for both types of disease-specific surveillance systems, there's investigation of all cases within a defined catchment area, laboratory confirmation, and collection of individual-level data, which is used regularly by immunization programs. In parallel, we also have national notifiable disease reporting from health facilities, and in some cases, outbreak or event-based surveillance, which captures reports from the community or media. And these are general systems that detect a number of diseases. And as part of this, detected VPD outbreaks may be investigated, but there's limited laboratory confirmation and usually only aggregate reporting, which is of limited use for immunization programs. The polio program supports a lot of this infrastructure in most countries, especially laboratory networks, surveillance officers, and field investigations. And it's important to recognize that as part of the polio transition, that these resources are at risk of going away. Beyond this challenge, we can say that we have fragmented or parallel VPD surveillance systems, most of the data collected not being fit for use by immunization programs, few diseases with robust surveillance, and weak laboratory capacity for the rest, especially for bacterial diseases. So what is comprehensive VPD surveillance? We can define it as the country, regional, and global systems required to meet the minimal recommended standards for surveillance for a set of priority vaccine-preventable diseases, with integration of surveillance support functions across other diseases or where possible. To describe more, we can say that comprehensive VPD surveillance will include more diseases and that for most diseases, this will include collection of individual level data and laboratory confirmation. The design of a comprehensive VPD surveillance could include a mix of nationwide case-based, aggregate, and sentinel surveillance, and this will be based on the objectives of the surveillance system, which should drive the design rather than the other way around. The strategy to achieve this will include integration or adaptation of existing systems where possible, and common VPD surveillance support functions and funding. Greater emphasis would be placed on the use of VPD surveillance data for routine program monitoring and increased data visualization to increase our understanding. Comprehensive VPD surveillance would be emphasized as an essential tool for EPI program decision-making and response. To better visualize how we'd build comprehensive VPD surveillance, let's start with our various surveillance system platforms in a country, which at present may only include robust surveillance for polio, measles, and neonatal tetanus. We would build up the various surveillance support functions in the country, including governance, infrastructure, coordination and evaluation, coordination, workforce capacity, logistics and communication, monitoring and evaluation and supervision. Then we would add various VPDs to these platforms through integration and adaptation of existing systems where possible. The support needed at the global level to achieve this vision would include development of standards both for VPD surveillance itself and for the related information systems, expansion of laboratory networks, including building up capacity for bacterial disease laboratory techniques, technical support for implementation, and advocacy, costing, and resource mobilization. Next month, revised WHO standards for VPD surveillance will be published with a number of updates since the 2003 version, including defining the minimal and enhanced surveillance standards for each disease, which would be implemented based on country objectives. A number of new diseases will also be included. As part of the new standards, countries are encouraged to prioritize the diseases to include in surveillance and adopt the new standards for those diseases. This could include diseases with global eradication and elimination goals, or those under the international health regulations, diseases with regional control goals, or those that are epidemic prone, and other diseases with a special priority because of the need for evidence-based decision-making around vaccine introduction or schedule change. Countries will be under no obligation to adopt the minimal surveillance standards for all VPDs. In these example scenarios for countries in the African region and the Southeast Asian region, you can see how a comprehensive VPD surveillance could vary in the diseases included by country. But in both cases, surveillance would include the needed program information for decision-making as prioritized by the immunization program. And by employing a systems-based approach to build VPD surveillance capacity, we could create greater efficiency and sustainability than the existing scenario. I'd like to thank the following individuals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Let me introduce the rest of the panel, which is here this afternoon. Professor Helen Rees, you met her earlier on, our distinguished keynote speaker. She's also the chair of the RITAG for us here in Afro. There is Ms. Lubna Hashmat, who is the CEO of the Civil Society Human and Institutional Development Program, a civil society organization in Pakistan. You've already met Dr. Greg Widmeyer, who is the Deputy Director of Vaccine Delivery Team in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Folake Olayinka, who is the Immunization Team Lead at JSI and also a RITAG member for us here in the African region. And Pascal, who is the Director of Country Support at Gavi. This is now the full panel before us. As I said, if I read their bios, we'll be here the whole afternoon. On the apps, you can see exactly what their bios are, so I crave your indulgence, as I said, when I begin to ask you questions. So let me start with you, Professor Rees. In her presentation, Dr. Scobie touched upon how surveillance is heavily dependent on polio infrastructure and funding. And this is particularly true, as you know, for African countries, which I think you touched on in your presentation. Now, in your opinion, what further actions can be taken by countries and immunization stakeholders to ensure that VPD labs and surveillance activities are sustained in the post-eradication era. And you know, in your capacity as our RITAG chair, can you tell us how you think the RITAG can advocate seriously for this objective? The microphones near you work, so please use those microphones.
Thank you. So I'm going to start the other way around and actually say what RITAG did. And one comment I think that I think I observed from the early discussions about polio transition was a kind of almost a surprise that it was really going to happen. I think one of the things that happens with international donor money is that we do develop a reliance, whether it's at national level or regional level, that we become quite reliant and we start to think that it's likely to be there forever. And when you suddenly face the reality that it's not, you have to then take stock. So I think that that was one of the first things that happened. And it was combined with the Ebola outbreak, the yellow fever outbreak in Angola, and a realization that our surveillance was extremely vulnerable and that we were going to have to take this over as well as other things post-polio. When we started to ask the questions from RITAG about, well, do we know who's paying for what at a national level, who's paying for the labs, who's paying for the services, some of those answers were there, but some of them were not there. So we asked then, we thought, actually what we need to do is to really evaluate what we have in the region. What do we have? Who's paying for what? And what are countries already paying for? And it comes to your first part of your question about what countries are paying for. Because in some places, countries are paying for part or all of their surveillance, mostly part of their surveillance. So if we are going to then push back and then say to countries, are you able to take this over? Do you need to reach out to alternative donor support pathways to support you? We need to first do a proper analysis. So what RITAG requested the region to do was to do a proper audit, to really understand what we currently have, what is dependent on polio, what might be dependent on other sources of donor funding, and take it from there.
Thank you very much, Helen. As an endemic country, Pakistan is working hard to interrupt polio virus transmission. At the same time, your country is also working towards strengthening immunization. Are these goals mutually exclusive? Do you think it's too early to start talking about polio transition in Pakistan? And how can civil society help in these discussions?
I will answer one by one and will put highlights on some of the salient features for polio program in Pakistan and how civil society could capitalize or could put forward its own services. So in Pakistan, the polio program is very successful. This year, only 2 cases out of 11 globally reported, which means we have made quite a good success. And next year, inshallah, there will be 0 cases. So there were 5 or 6 major features of polio program in Pakistan. Feature 1 was accountability. There was strict accountability of the program of each and every worker at all levels. There were huge resources set aside for the exclusive polio program, and there were huge cadre of frontline workers, trained, reliable, trustworthy, reaching hard-to-reach areas, each and every child, whether it is conflict-affected areas or fragile area or hard-to-reach area. And they created data which was reliable, evidence of children who were not reached or who were without routine immunization, and their communication was very strong. So your question 1 was, are these 2, routine immunization and polio programs, are mutually exclusive? To me, no. These are, there should be synergies, they're integrated, they're one goal for achieving highest immunization coverage rates in Pakistan. That's how we will eradicate polio. Otherwise, polio is not going to sustain. And if I analyze, my personal opinion is that although we have eradicated many cases, but we have not successfully created demand for polio vaccines. So the program is successful because we are reaching out to each and every door, each and every child. Parents have not started coming and demanding for polio vaccines. So this is one important area I'm flagging because CSOs then put forward their own services. I don't think that it is too early to start discussions about transition. it is very pertinent because we are not talking about transition per se, we're talking about integrating polio best practices into routine immunization so that we can strengthen routine immunization. So it is not going to transit per se from Pakistan, it is going to integrate into the system. And how CSOs can serve or put forward their services. In my opinion, we as a civil society group ensure voices of communities are heard. Since polio program has not created demand as such, civil society can put forward its own value of being present right at the community level, having credible relationships with the fragile and conflict-affected areas, in hard-to-reach areas, in poor communities. We can be a value-added stakeholder for that. We are also very good in conducting researches, qualitative researches. We are not, I don't claim that civil society is very good at creating data coverage surveys, but we are very good in capturing perspective of the community, voices of the community, so we can document best practices which we have experimented under polio program and integrate those into the routine immunization. We are very good in social mobilization, so we see in Pakistan particularly that 3 or 4 major facts. The ratio of poor people are very high. We have conflict-affected areas. We have fragile areas which borders some parts of Afghanistan, which borders some part of India, which borders some part of Iran as well. We have concentration of urban poor. Top 10 urban slums exist in Pakistan. So we have concentration of slum areas in megacities. Our development indicators are very low. And under the Moody's rating, Pakistan is rated as negative. So we don't expect Pakistan to raise domestic financing. So what is the third approach? So in my opinion, civil society organizations are cheap. Civil society organizations have presence at the community level, and civil society organizations have capacity to put forward their services to strengthen routine immunization at the country level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lubna. Now I'm going to move to you, Greg. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation continues to be a strong supporter of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, and we appreciate that. In your opinion, how do you think partners can help countries to sustain polio investments and use them in a way that will strengthen immunization in the post-2020 context? Over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for having us here. And I wouldn't be true to my organization without saying that the first job for, I hope all of us feel that our first job is to finish the job. We hope that all of you feel that whether you're working in routine immunization or in the polio program, that that it's our duty to help strengthen the weakest systems where polio is still hanging on. But I have a few messages, maybe a message for donors and implementing partners and some of the technical agencies working in the area. A message for us as an immunization community, and then a few examples of where I think there's some really concrete opportunities for leveraging what the polio program does very, very well. I think first for us as a community as a whole, we should recognize that there's probably a greater opportunity for us to integrate our transition conversations into the routine planning conversations that occur in the EPI program. Whether in the 16 priority transition countries, all those countries are Gavi eligible, and Gavi has a fairly strong process for driving planning conversations, and there's pretty high variability in terms of the extent to which polio transition conversations are occurring in those venues, and I think that that's a low-hanging fruit for opportunities to contribute. I think for donors, there's a reckoning, I think, about, and I've put my own organization right in the center of this conversation, a reckoning about how we fund and have historically funded polio activities. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we more effectively channel funds towards government systems? I think for the implementing partners that have received many of those resources over the years, we have to ask ourselves, or they have to ask themselves, how do we channel that funding into building immunization systems versus continuing some of the parallel systems that we've experienced? And I think that goes back to some of the comments and good examples. I mean, we certainly have exemplars of where that has been done very effectively. I think Dr. Haldar referred to a few of those in his presentation. Lastly, maybe I come back to a few examples of where I think there's just some really great practices that we could inculcate the EPI program with more regularly. First, as was said, I think GPI has done a great job of what I call counting kids. You know, there's a real focus on increasing the number of kids immunized, whether that's finding kids in border areas, whether that's finding migrant populations. And I think in our work in routine immunization, and that's the side of the foundation that I work on, we still remain very obsessed by measuring our progress in coverage targets. And I think we can adopt a little bit of that counting kid mentality in our work and how we measure our progress. I think, as Luna alluded to from polio, the accountability frameworks that exist in polio and in many countries are strong. And we should look to the places where that has worked very, very well and see if some of that can't be brought into our discussions around our progress in EPI, especially as we get towards these more difficult issues that we discussed this morning around equity. And then lastly, I think, and we, you know, in many, many, many different ways and formats, the polio program has done an excellent job of creating political will in some geographies. And whether that's leveraging traditional leaders, whether that's creating support for the program at the highest level, whether it's starting to finance some of the assets that have been built over the decades of the program, I think we really need to look there to see if there's more that we can borrow from that in terms of the way that they've been able to get attention at the highest level there. Maybe a word of caution on the donor front, because I think we use the euphemistic term partner sometimes to mean a lot of things. But on the donor side, I mean, the Gates Foundation remains committed to funding the program, the polio program, and I think we're having our own reckoning internally about how we participate and show up in the surveillance conversation, which historically I think we've been very reflective of some of the challenges with the surveillance system that Heather mentioned in her presentation. But I think folks also have to be realistic, as Professor Rees said, about the other funding that flows into the program. And I don't think that we can count on in that next decade, as we alluded to this morning, the fact that all bilateral donors are going to behave in the ways they have historically. And I don't know that it means that those funds are actually going to move out of global health investments, but I think it's going to be challenging to consider and remain confident that those stay in immunization, that they stay in polio, and that they stay with the same implementing partners. I think that that's a reckoning that we may all have to come to terms with as we do this planning process. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Greg. Civil society has been quite vocal in drawing attention to the risks of the polio funding rundown to routine immunization. How do you think civil society organizations can be a part of the solution and advocate for realigning partnerships to strengthen immunization as part of the post-2020 agenda?
But this is a really, really important question, and we're actually at a point in time where we have an opportunity to create new partnerships with civil society. Civil society is not one single homogeneous entity. It's very diverse. It includes community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, professional associations, community and citizens groups. So if you look at it in this light, you see that civil society actually brings the power of a vast array of skills and expertise that can be deployed for immunization, for broader health, for primary health care. Within the polio program, a lot of actions of civil society has been almost restricted within social mobilization and demand generation, forgetting the broader skill set and expertise that civil society actually brings. So really, if we're able to see civil society in that light, then we're able to tap into the influence and the agency which they bring. Some examples of what civil society can do. You talk about legislation. I mean, they're able to engage parliamentarians and legislators to pass laws that will speak to governments and domestic funding. You see things like service delivery, particularly where the health system is not able to reach, hard to reach, urban slums. We've seen cases of this in a number of countries. There's also holding government accountable. So again, great roles that can be tapped into in the post-2020, but I would say waiting for 2020 is too late. We should have started it yesterday. I want to also give an example of USAID's, some of their work. I actually work on USAID's Global Maternal Child Survivor Program as a team lead. And they've invested hugely in a model with the core group, which has worked on polio in India and a number of countries. And they, initially were involved in social mobilization, but being in the communities, gaining the trust of the communities, really meant that they needed to shift that focus to meet the needs of the communities, to broader maternal and child health issues. And they did just that. So retooling for that purpose. Just also, when you look at it, how can civil society be better engaged? How do we work with civil society? I'm not sure you asked me that, but I'm going to tell you. Anyway, one, systematic inclusion. If the voices are not in the room, then it becomes very difficult to get that input. They are part of the social and normative fabric in the community. So they bring those voices. They bring those nuances that really will help any program move forward. The second area would be having a coordinated approach. So you've got civil society for Global Fund, malaria, civil society, Gavi, CSO, you've got UHC. But I think really having a coordinated platform allows us to harness the power of civil society and leverage it more effectively for the priorities identified in the countries. And then the third one would be to look at how we can retool. We've talked today, and I think it was Professor Helen who really brought out the issue around domestic financing, that civil society can play a role in looking at smart ways of increasing domestic financing. We need to engage, provide those skill set to actors within government and outside government. Again, these are roles that civil society can play. So again, not 2020, but yesterday. Thank you.
Excellent. I like someone who wants work not tomorrow, but today, or yesterday even. So you are on the ball. Now let me turn to Pascal. Gavi, as you have heard since this morning, front and center, past, present, and future, Gavi is needed around the table. So my question to you is, health systems challenges are undermining sustainability, and sustainability is one of the pillars of what Gavi talks about. But not much has been invested by external partners in this area. There continues to be a preference for vertical funding. In your opinion, how can countries shape their ownership and leadership of the health agenda to influence donors and the global initiatives positively, which in turn would then help us all to achieve universal immunization coverage? Over to you, Pascal.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for that good set of questions. I think they pertain in large part to issues broader than just polio. So I'll start maybe on the bigger picture and then finish with a few words specifically on polio. I think the first thing I want to say is to dispel this idea or this dichotomy that we try sometimes to do about vertical funding versus horizontal funding and health systems and so forth. I think a lot of these so-called vertical funds, like Gavi Global Fund and others, have invested actually quite a lot in health system strengthening and have benefited quite a bit the health system. And so I think these are two very complementary things, sort of using disease-specific approaches as entry points, but then marrying that with horizontal health system strengthening approaches. And so we shouldn't see them as one against the other. So that was my first point. And I actually, you know, our host country here, Rwanda, is a great example of a country that's really been able to do just that and to leverage these so-called vertical funds for their health systems. In fact, I remember being myself here working with the government maybe 8-9 years ago when they repurposed tens of millions of dollars of PEPFAR funding for a very ambitious human resources for health program, right? And they did that on the basis of a strong plan, strong vision, and the trust that they had built. And so that leads me then to answer sort of, or to try to answer some of your question around what does it take for governments, countries to really influence some of these dynamics. And so I'm going to come back to that notion that I also shared this morning, this idea of trust, mutual trust, and creating that enabling environment, that climate that allows for more flexibility and more engagement towards health system strengthening interventions as opposed to very project-oriented approaches. And that, you know, to your point about inclusiveness, that includes being inclusive, it includes being transparent, it includes being accountable. So that is the first thing that I think if you don't have that ingredient, it's very difficult for partners, for donors to be more flexible. Secondly, you need to have a strong vision, a strong plan that's credible, that's well thought through, and that has the buy-in of all the different stakeholders, and against which everyone can commit against, including the government, right? So getting that national commitment. Nigeria, to come back to Nigeria, who spoke about sort of the recent developments, I think is also a good example of how recently things are beginning to turn around. From Gavi's perspective, we've had a challenging relationship with Nigeria over the last 6 or 7 years, I would say. But I think since about a year or two ago, we've really seen a shift and an increasing building of that trust and seeing that commitment, seeing the government really take things in their own hand, put together a plan, commit to mobilizing resources, and that has enabled Gavi to move forward with this ambitious approach for the coming years. So again, to those ingredients. And a third ingredient, which is often overlooked, is management capacity. So you can build the trust, you can have good plans, but if you don't have the right management capacity, both at the national and the subnational level, to implement effectively those plans and to coordinate what's been agreed on, you won't get very far. And today, that's, I think, one area, and if we come back to the health system investment, that has been seriously underinvested in. It's that whole layer of just basic management capacity. How do you get from A to B effectively? And then the last one, which is more sort of at the global scene, countries have a huge role to play as well. There are on the boards of all of these global health initiatives representatives from countries. They typically represent constituencies, but their voice is incredibly important. And we are constantly craving to hear that voice and to listen to the countries and counting on them to help us orient how we should be doing business. But unfortunately, very often that voice isn't as strong as it could be. And we tend to hear more the other voices on these kinds of boards than the actual country voices. And so again, something to think about. How can we strengthen that voice in those global forums? So all this is very similar in the polio world. I think from Gary's perspective, I think we also recognize that initially, yes, I think polio was really seen as a risk in the transition as a risk, but increasingly we're seeing that opportunity. I really like this idea of not talking about transition, but about integrating polio into routine immunization. And for example, we're really now asking our teams to engage much more proactively in those dialogues at the country level that Greg was mentioning as part of this country dialogue to develop Gavi support, in particular in those countries that have had a huge polio legacy, yet still have extremely weak systems. I'm thinking of the South Sudans, the Somalias, the Chads, DRCs, etc., where really we are looking now to much more proactively engage in a dialogue to see where and how we can best seize this opportunity and integrate what's worked well from polio and the assets that are there to strengthen routine immunization. And we have a lot of good examples already. Bangladesh, India, the DRC as well, where actually we're supporting a number of positions at the subnational level that are also core polio positions around surveillance. So I think there are good examples out there that we can learn from and build on. But at the end of the day, just like the broader picture, it'll be, the onus is on the national leadership to seize that opportunity, to make those linkages, to connect the dots, and to make a strong case for integrating those assets in ways that will be sustainable and will truly reinforce routine immunization.
Thank you very much. I think I'll go back. Someone said, I think it was at the beginning, the children that are being immunized don't belong to Gavi or to WHO or to UNICEF or to whoever. They belong to our countries. So that ownership story, that being ready to understand partners will go home one day and we will still have our children to look after. Are you hearing it too? I seem to be hearing it. It seems to be coming from our panelists. So they have done their bit for now. I'm now going to turn over to you if you have any questions, any comments, any additions. If you have a particular question to a particular person, please say so that the person takes notes and is ready to respond.
Okay, my name is Katrina Kretzinger. I'm with WHO headquarters. I'm the Measles and Rubella team lead at Interim. And I just wanted a question. I was really pleased to see the comprehensive surveillance included in this. It's very exciting. The one thing that I noticed that you didn't include, which I think is going to be important and quite challenging, is the integration of the VPD surveillance component with the other actors who have an interest, particularly in the emergencies departments, and what the vision is for how that's going to happen moving forward. Thanks.
Bob Davis, American Red Cross. To a certain extent, my comment, which is not addressed to any particular panel member, is a follow-on to Katrina's comment. We have recently learned in Papua New Guinea that unfortunately they had CVD-PV in an area outside Port Moresby. Can you hear me now? We have recently learned that in Papua New Guinea they had transmission of CVD-PV in an area outside Port Moresby. In the case of Kenya, which has seen declining AFP surveillance from 2014 to 2018, they had polio transmission, which was undetected by AFP surveillance and fortunately picked up by environmental sampling in a district of Nairobi. I just wanted to flag an anxiety of mine, and that is that while we keep talking about VPD surveillance, are we ratcheting down AFP surveillance, and particularly funding for AFP surveillance more quickly than is warranted by the data? Thank you.
Professor Tetanye Ikwe, coming from Cameroon, a member of RITAG. I would like to congratulate my sister Folake for her speech, where she was putting emphasis on the power of this civil society in our countries. I think that is very important to really promote this ownership in our countries. I'm very hopeful to listen to what is happening in Nigeria, which is close to my own country, Cameroon. But my question is this, my sister Folake. When trying to improve or to promote or to stress, to trigger this empowerment of our civil society, why do you forget the power of communication, the newspapers, which seems to be the only power of this civil society when trying to promote legal ownership, leadership, and so all parliamentarians to trigger the laws which are so lacking in our countries. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Robin Bielik, I'm a former UNICEF staff member, former WHO staff member, and currently a member of the Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Group here in Africa. This is not going to be a thesis, but I had the experience. I hope there's nobody here from Bangladesh. I'm going to speak about an experience in Bangladesh. For the one and only time I worked on a polio transition plan, I was in Bangladesh with WHO, and we were able to establish very quickly that in the transition thinking, the government had already fully integrated surveillance functions into the normal operation of the Ministry of Health. The laboratory support for surveillance was, financially it was already covered within the ministry, but we hit the difficulty of the medical surveillance officers, which are not very numerous and were not paid a different salary to government staff. But when we came to that very, very tricky question of convincing the government to transition the medical surveillance officers over to government posts, then we hit an obstacle. And despite everything that you've seen over the years, and especially most recently, in terms of working with governments to take ownership, to be prepared for these transitions which are coming, to be ready for assuming the responsibilities of the medical surveillance officers, really we had failed. And those medical surveillance officers have not been absorbed into the government payroll, and we don't know what's going to happen. We can't finish the transition exercise until. So all this to say that I would challenge the panel, but also our partners in general, to be thinking a lot more about the work that has to be done with governments prior to settling down to write a transition plan, because we've seen examples where they're simply not ready for assuming the financial and other responsibilities which are coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Nasir Yusuf. I'm with the UNICEF Regional Office for East and Southern Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'd like to also thank the panelists for the very rich information they've shared with us. I just wanted to start with my brother, Joseph, Nigeria. Yeah, thanks. It's so, I'm so glad to know that a lot of progress have been made. It's no longer business as usual. And you've highlighted quite a number of initiatives and strategies that will improve the program, including the commitment at the level of the presidency, the state governor, the local government authorities. Yeah. So my question is this: do you have strategies to sustain all this in view of the constant changes, right from the presidency to the state to everywhere? Because I'm afraid that if we were to have changes tomorrow, I'm not sure all this commitment will continue. So that is for Nigeria. I wanted to see this.
I thank panelists for their ideas. I am Dasher, coming from DRC, a very big country, very big because facing a lot of challenges like Ebola disease, like cholera outbreak, over than 55,000 cases this year, last year, and facing also CVD-PV2 outbreak last year and this year. Why I give this? Because I think for surveillance, we need a lot in DRC. We need a lot, and we discuss with the Ministry of Health, and we develop a transition plan, and the ministry agree on the transition plan. But when come the time for funding for the activities, no, we have no money. No, we have no money. And when the ramp down from polio came last year, and we separate with 35 of our staff in WHO, the surveillance commenced to decrease, and when we asked the government to put something to be sure that the staff in the remote area will be in the system, no, we have no money. That's why we go to Gavi, and Gavi help us with 11 staff in the remote area. But my question is the transition plan a kind of dialogue of deaf people? The ministry agrees, the governments agreed at the regional committees about the transition, but when comes the time for putting something, no.
Thank you. The dialogue of the deaf. That's a new one. Dialogue of the deaf.
Hello, I'm Laura Kerr. I work for Results UK, and I'm also a member of the Gavi CSO Steering Committee. To keep it very short, I just wonder about the timeline of this. I think it's great there's all this conversation about integration and comprehensive vaccine-preventable disease surveillance, but how do we turn this into something that kind of happens now to make sure those gaps are not left at a time when we know that funding is already decreasing, as just highlighted correctly by my colleague?
Okay, good afternoon all. I'm Dr. Arun Chaturvedi from India, based at Uttar Pradesh State EPI Officer. I will address two questions, one from the panelists first, that is Nigeria. This is how you have worked on the optimized integrated routine immunization sessions. Just please explain that. And second question regarding this from fifth panelist regarding Pakistan. How you have worked with this inaccessible population like militant areas, Naxalite areas? What was the, in fact, process you are working there? That's important. Thank you.
I'm going to hold the conversation from the floor for now. I would like our panelists, before they forget, to respond to some. Some had specific questions, others didn't have, but if you feel you've got an idea, please chip in. So I'm going to start with Nigeria. You had more questions, I think.
I think the first question is on sustainability. Well, as you all know, we've left military regime for a long period, and I think most of the things now are being legislated. Like the National Health Act, which was passed, is on paper, is written, so it's not going to be changed by anybody. Now they know that for every 1% of Nigerians' income, it goes for health, for the health sector. That is there. Then most of the things that have been done now, they are written down. So it's not as if they discuss it on a dinner and everybody forgets. So everything is written down and it's been done. Like using the polio infrastructure, the presidential task force on polio, it wasn't started by President Buhari, but it's on and it's continuous. We used it during the measles campaign because that was a platform where all the governors came together and were asked, put money for your measles campaign, and they did. Then on the ORIS, the optimized integrated routine, before now, we have different people going to the field. They're going to supervise polio polio, going to supervise immunization, going to supervise. We now felt it is not the best, it's not effective. So now all programs are put, they come together, have a meeting, and look, we're going for a supportive supervision on so date. People from malaria will join, people from reproductive health, they all join. So they all go there. And now it has been made compulsory for most of the health facilities in those 18 prioritized states to do integrated kind of work. So it's no longer going to be just immunization alone on Friday, tomorrow, next day you do antenatal. They do all of this together so that it becomes easier and more effective for the people to follow. Thank you.
So to respond to Dr. Kretzinger about integration with other programs like the Emergency Response Program, I think that an important first step were these WHO standards, so clearly indicating what the minimal standard is by disease. If the immunization program decided that this disease was important to monitor for their program, to have it clearly stated what the minimal standard is, which for some cases is case-based surveillance. So I think for too long we've sort of been lacking this very clear guidance from WHO about this minimal standard, and we've increasingly you see like DHIS2 has become a default kind of surveillance tool, or increasingly default surveillance tool in a lot of countries, which is exclusively an aggregate reporting system for the most part. And so again, it's this idea of the objectives of the surveillance system driving the design rather than the other way around. And so I hope that the WHO standards are a good starting point to basically start to talk to people and other programs about how do we make integrated tools that address these objectives rather than using the tools that we have and making do.
I have a direct question, but I just want to, I mean, clearly I think everyone here agrees that the funding situation is going to change, that governments need to look for their own resources, they're going to have to be creative in how they identify those resources. So there's best practice there about how can governments look in a creative way to develop these resources. But one of the things that we are going to hopefully generate through the RITAG is the investment case. Because, you know, what we were doing, I think, quite a lot of at the beginning was to say, it's not fair, why are you taking this money away? You, the donors, mustn't take the money away, you absolutely have to keep giving it. And that doesn't really wash anymore. So we have to change our language, and we have to say, we can make the investment case. We can see that, we can get you to see that this is a really good investment in terms of development, but also in terms of things like global health security, all the things that will press international buttons. So I think making that investment case, using some of the things you were talking about what is best practice, what's minimum best practice, if you like, for different diseases, so countries can prioritize. Countries could then pick and choose and start to develop their own recipe for what's going to work for them, and be able to go and sell it on an international platform if they continue to need international assistance.
Thank you. 3 responses. One, we engage local CSOs. We do not bring in non-local CSOs to those areas, hostile areas, conflict-affected areas. Second, we mobilize them, or we make them convinced or believe us that it is about saving lives of their children. If they believe it, they don't react. And the third very important point is that we don't interfere in any of the affairs. It is not about anything political. It is not about anything religious. It is about saving lives of their children. That's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Tatayi, for that question. Civil society absolutely can use communication as a tool for engaging a host of stakeholders. But I wanted to open up that space that, yes, it's communication, but it's much more than that. And there are many tools on the communication platform: oral knowledge, social media. You talked about multimedia platforms, but they also can use things like scorecards, and bring in a lot of innovative tools for their various objectives. So it's not one objective, it can be multiple. And also to open up that space that these skill sets do exist. They can generate evidence. Nubla talked about the power of civil society to generate particularly qualitative evidence and bring out the community voices, where they would not be heard. So this is a very important role that civil society can play. And also on documentation. Again, USAID is working with a group of partners to document what has worked in polio eradication, community engagement, and communication. How can that be helpful as a document that others and anyone can use, basically? So a wide range of things, but I agree with you 100%.
To reflect on some of the comments that were made around covering the costs or picking up the tab that was previously covered by GPEI, and the question of salaries and other costs, or the Dialogue des Sourds in the DRC. I think perhaps, and I could be wrong, I'm not myself, haven't been deeply engaged on polio specifically, but I have gotten the sense that perhaps those transition plans haven't been as sharp and as focused as they could have been. And maybe to Helen's point around, really what we need is an investment case. It feels like a lot of these transition plans have just been more an inventory of, here's the assets and this much, and we need to mobilize money, right? Instead of having it really as an investment case and then followed by a real dialogue where there's some sort of agreement, recognizing that it can't be overnight. It's going to take a few years, perhaps, and there needs to be some mutual kind of agreement, just like we operate at Gavi, where there is an understanding that there's a co-financing mechanism, and it's strictly adhered to. And if countries default on their co-financing, there are actual implications. I think sometimes we haven't been ourselves strict enough in terms of how we use these accountability mechanisms and stay firmer. And so perhaps we really need to go down that path to have more realistic outcomes when it comes to polio integration.
Right. I'm going to take the last 3 questions. Oh, la la.
Yes, thank you. My name is Andrew Esano. I work with Federation of the Red Cross. I have 2 comments. The first one is, we all are talking about ownership. It's the sing-song ownership everywhere. We've done, if you look at the polio program, we've built laboratories, world standard laboratories as a result of the polio program through surveillance. But look at vaccine security, for example. We haven't done much in terms of bringing production of vaccine closer to those that really need it, producing vaccines in those countries. So we need to look at that area. Maybe Gavi can help us to push a lot. Secondly, we shouldn't be looking at programs as vertical or horizontal. I think that term is not comfortable to use. I want to support Lubna and Pascal. They are complementary. You have long distance race, you have 100-meter dash. They are for reasons. You have long trucks, and you have 100-meter speed vehicles. These are complementary programs. So we need to change our mindset. We need to change with programs as we evolve, because the diseases are changing, and there are emergency situations like Ebola. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dayo Adetifa, and I work for the London School, but based in Kenya. I've got 2 quick questions. One is general to the panel, and it's following on what a colleague from Pakistan said. In my views, do we think that all the GPI efforts have truly created community demand for polio vaccines, or are people just receiving that? Because it would seem that with all what we're saying about with government and all of that, there still isn't sufficient ownership. If there's something working very well that has served the purpose over time and that's about to go away, you expect that the owners should be show a bit more worry And that worry, even if they can't pay for it, but that worry shows in the way they approach for assistance to deal with that. And I'm not sure, maybe I haven't been in enough countries, but it'd be nice to see if your collective experience, you think, you agree with me that this is a problem. A second quick question is to Dr. Scooby. I'm a bit worried about surveillance. I mean, surveillance works very well when you set it up, especially for those of us in the academia to measure what you want. But I'm worried about the separation of surveillance or diagnostic capacity from actually clinical care. I think, again, maybe it's a matter of making the investment case or something, but I think governments need to recognize the need to strengthen all or most microbiology or parasitology or virology laboratories in their secondary and tertiary centers as part of routine clinical care, and then they can serve the purpose of surveillance that is needed for, monitor impact of vaccines. I mean, is this correct or are they separate?
Thank you. I'm Ulla Griffiths from UNICEF. So I just want to build a bit on what Helen and Pascal said about the investment cases. And I think it's true, and I think perhaps what we've done so far in polio transition is looking too much about how it's working and how we can maintain what's working. Because I don't think the investment case for continuing AFP surveillance is going to be very strong. I mean, polio is going to be eradicated, so I'm an economist. If I'm going to put money on what it costs and what I get out of it, it's going to be hard to prove, especially to government, who's never paid for this AFP surveillance. So I think we have to start thinking of a bit what Heather said. What do we need? How is the surveillance going to look like? What's the minimum standard? And say, okay, this is what we need, and this is the investment case, and yes, AFP is part of it. But we really have to just step back and try and change and not try and continue what we've been doing for the 30 years doing polio surveillance, because that's not what we're going to invest in. It's going to be something new, and that's what we're going to have to define. So let's try and forget about all these asset mappings and whatever we've done. It's been useful, but I'm not thinking it's taking us where we want to go.
Hi, I'm Lori Sloat. I'm with the UN Foundation. I'm also part of the Measles and Rubella Initiative as a partnership alliance, as many of you are aware. So I just wanted to pick up also on the surveillance aspect and a few things that have said, and then I have a question. So agree that, I mean, if you look at what the minimum standards are and then the work that the RITAG is going to do to actually say, okay, there's an audit countrywide of what exists, there's still going to be a gap. And then to Greg's point of, well, is the money that's been pumped into the polio infrastructure going to continue in the health finance world, so to speak? Well, it could if we prove the case that it's needed functional-wise in terms of surveillance for all the diseases that are out there building off the polio infrastructure. So if we have a general plan that's costed of what are the gaps in that, then it's like everybody, including civil society, can help mobilize for the resources around that. And Gavi could potentially then look at some of the plans countries ask for health systems financing along those aspects. So you start filling the gaps. But what's needed is some kind of plan where we can all align to see what's clearly funded, what's not funded, what's needed. So my question is this the plan? Will it actually be costed in that sense? Where on the one hand we have audited what countries need, and on the other what is literally the gap that's not provided by domestic resource mobilization and what the global community needs to mobilize resources for, working with the funds like Gavi and even the Global Fund if necessary.
Good afternoon. Pauline Harvey, WHO India, National Polio Surveillance Project, or NPSP. Really want to congratulate the organizers for this session. It's really important for us to have this cross-sharing, cross-learning, having some ideas to what we see as the challenges. I found it interesting that nobody posed a question to India. Sitting in this forum, India perhaps has had the most complex context around polio transition for multiple reasons. There are 36 states. Nigeria also has 36 states. We have the largest population, second to China, in the world. And these 36 states are all autonomous. Health is a state subject. Building off of the legacy, the infrastructure that was put in through the GPEI, of which we're eternally grateful to all the donors and partners who continue to carry that forward until we wrap up polio. It is really interesting to see how India went from heavy 100% reliance on GPEI funding to come to a point where the government of India is now able to put domestic resources, not fully funding yet, but recognizing the importance of this network. At the end of the day, it becomes a country-specific context pushing for this. but also recognizing the unique role that partners still continue to play. We still have a very strong relationship with all the partners represented here and others. It might not be from a budgetary perspective in a huge way, but the technical partnership is priceless. We will continue to do surveillance into eternity, so to speak, for, not only for VPDs, but for other public health issues. And there's a lot that I think other countries potentially stand to learn from India. So I would encourage folks here and others to reach out to the Ministry of Health to see and understand, despite the massive challenges, how they're able to do this. Domestic funding for health is still not quite what Western countries might want to see it at in terms of gross domestic product put towards health. But nonetheless, there are a lot of lessons to learn. And I really want to appreciate this ongoing effort as we transition away from reliance on global polio eradication funds to full reliance on Government of India funds through sustaining the gains made in polio, strengthening RI, moving beyond RI, VPDs, other things. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Right. Panelists, one last, anyone who has one last? Yes, please.
I'll just try to address a few of the questions. Number one, CDC and WHO are involved in some costing activities around the comprehensive VPD surveillance idea that I presented. And to answer Dayo's question around, yeah, you're right that currently a lot of the laboratory surveillance we do, it's for a public health purpose rather than diagnostic. And part of that is by necessity around the quality control and the quality assurance aspects. So all of these laboratories are certified by WHO, and you can think of it as if you want to decentralize that capacity to the country, it's another level of capacity that needs to be built, the capacity to go around to the different laboratories or assure that they're meeting quality standards. So I would say, yeah, that would be, it's a great goal to put out there that we can use this laboratory testing in real time for diagnosis, but we're sort of not there yet, and it's something to aspire to, I think.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience, your knowledge. We had a lot of very fantastic comments from the floor. Food for thought as we go home. What exactly is going to happen? We talked about challenges, but challenges are also the flip side of opportunities. Can we look at where are the challenges, but how can we turn those challenges into opportunities? We can learn from each other. We have heard from the two, I think, second and third largest population countries that are grappling, but are moving in the right direction. So there is hope for us all, that if they can do it, the rest of the world should be able to do it. I wish to thank you for all the questions and the comments that you gave, and let's keep on it. The job has to be done, if I have to borrow what Greg said. Let's finish the job. Let's finish the job. Let's get back and make sure that routine immunization is strengthened, because minus that, we are going to go backwards. So that is clearly on the table. Partners are there to help us. They are not there to replace us. So each of us belongs to some nationality or other. I think civil society has said they can help us to hold our governments accountable. On that note, let me close this session and thank everybody who has made it to this session. You have a 30-minute break before the next session starts, so enjoy your tea, stretch out, reach out, talk to the next person, find out more that you can do. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.